I think the first thing we could say is that the Catholic Church in the United States is a relatively young church by European standards. So evidently that there is a pope from the United States is not only novel historically, but it's an invitation to the Church in the United States to think of herself as coming into a certain kind of maturity or as having a certain place in the global church that is of potential significance. You might say it this way: the experience of the Church in the United States has nurtured and fostered vocations, but now it's nurtured and fostered the vocation of an American pope. And that means that many of the strengths, perhaps the vulnerabilities, and many of the intuitions of the Church in the United States could be of service to the global church through this new pontiff. Well, what could those values be, or those, you might say, experiences? I mean, one thing to note about the Catholic Church in America is that in the United States, not only do you have the longstanding experience, and you might say confrontation in some ways, of Roman Catholicism with a majority Protestant modern culture, but also with the whole technological development of modernity, so many aspects of the modern educational system, modern financial and economic, political history, and really also with the advent of intensive forms of scientific atheism and modern liberalism and modern secularism. So, like, the Church in the United States has been through a lot and weathered it to varying degrees of health, but in some sense survived, and even found ways to evangelize modern people in a rather secular climate, people who are really not attuned necessarily to the importance of the religious dimension of the human person. This sort of health, and there is a sector of deep health in the Roman Catholic Church in America, it's something of vital importance. It's a way of being both traditional and modern, of being in the modern world and of the apostolic tradition. And I think Pope Leo has a lot of this in his own background: a math major, Villanova, educated in modern philosophy in some of his classes. Also has this idea of going out and taking his American, you might say, privileged educational experience and formation and being of the service of others in Peru as a young priest. There's a kind of eccentricity of the American soul, in the good sense, of going out from the center of yourself into what is other to be of service to others. That's not everything that happens in the United States. There's selfishness among Americans. There's nationalism that's self-protective. But there's also a kind of dimension of mission that's even in the national spirit of the American people. And that's in the Catholic Church in the United States. There's many people who've become missionaries far and wide from the United States, especially through the religious orders. And that one of them has become the Pope seems to me to be potentially very promising. So this is a really hard question and an interesting one, and any answer given would have to be very hypothetical, but let's just observe this. When John Paul II came in 1993 to Denver for World Youth Day, the American Catholic Church was somewhat polarized, and there were a lot of questions about whether that visit would be well received, and it turned out to be enormously well received and hugely influential, and it galvanized a generation of vocations. One of the things that John Paul II chose to do was to speak, you might say, down a generation to the young people of the modern era in Europe and in the United States, and to challenge them to consider a vocation to the religious life. I was one of those people who he addressed and who was affected by him. But I think at the time, what was clear was that it was a teaching pontificate. I would call it a kind of luminous pontificate with a lot of encyclicals and apostolic letters ordered toward the communication of the fullness of the Catholic truth in a deep way, in a challenging way, in a sophisticated way. And it was an invitation to young people to allow the gospel to permeate their minds and hearts and to respond radically to the call of Christ. I think that we don't know yet what Leo XIV will do in this regard, but the precedent of speaking to young people who are seeking, you might say, roots or orientation in the midst of the modern secular world, I think there's going to be something like this that's reminiscent by analogy to the era of John Paul II, at least in some respects. And I think it may have, I'm just guessing, but I think it may have to do with spirituality. The Pope is immersed in the writings of St. Augustine, and already just some months into the pontificate, one can observe that he's a keen religious psychologist in the sense that he sees somewhat deeply into the psyche of persons in light of his study of the Augustinian theology of the human person, and also probably his longstanding experience as a superior in the Augustinian tradition. So, I think we're living in a time when people are often looking beyond just material comforts or even academic perspectives and trying to find a deeper grounding. You see that in the sort of interest in the liturgy. You see it in the interest in interior life that could give meaning where maybe there hasn't been enough sense of purchase on things just from the accommodations of the age, from what can be offered through the normal vehicles of culture. I think that the spiritual life of the church speaks deeply to a lot of young people right now, and Pope Leo XIV could speak probably to the spiritual thirst of the younger generation today in ways very similar to or analogous to John Paul II. If he allies his pontificate with messages like those of Leo XIII on not just the Catholic social doctrine, but the philosophical and theological traditions of the church, that could even be augmented in some significant ways. And I think we might expect that. So to be seen, but these are very intriguing suggestions. So the church is going to advocate for the importance of international law with reference to natural law and, you might say, rational human law that's applicable to all times and all places, but also is taking account of contemporary situations. We're clearly looking at the emergence of a new landscape of nationalisms from countries as diverse as China and Turkey and Russia to the United States. And that's a challenge to international relations. It's also an invitation to rethink the grounds for healthy international relations. And I think the Vatican has a very privileged perspective and capacity in that regard, not only because she's guided by the higher light of the gospel and the longstanding traditions of natural law jurisprudence, but also because she has a diplomatic corps present in more countries, I think, than virtually anyone in the world. So there's a center of information there about what really is possible or what's dangerous in regard to social relations. I could expect that Leo XIV is going to continue to work closely with the Secretary of State and the Vatican to assure, you might call it an attempt at an organized and coherent rationality in the service of natural law and international law. That's the longstanding policy of the Vatican, and it has its highs and lows. There's been times when it's been more functional, less functional. But I think we're going to move into a period where that's going to be very important because of the political turmoil and instability. One of the places this is especially acute has to do with war and peace. I mean, we're obviously looking at major geopolitical struggles, important forms of warfare that are massively damaging to human life and human welfare, and which are going to have intergenerational repercussions. So we can definitely expect that this Pope is going to address the basis for international peace, relations of justice, forgiveness, and humane communion between persons, and is going to advocate for that in practical ways and in policy forms. I think we can also expect to see more reflection on immigration because, look, immigration's a big part of our world. It's related to demographic decline. You've got major sectors of the world where there aren't enough births to support the future economies of like Northern Europe, I think also the United States and other areas. So there's going to be a natural, you might say, vulnerability or receptivity to migration. And at the same time, there's obviously real challenges to legality, to management, to cultural stability, and also to justice and fairness towards migrants and people who are trying to immigrate for all kinds of reasons, often for reasons that are quite understandable and that also pertain to challenges to human rights or threats to human well-being that are really grave. So the church is going to remain invested in that because it's a major issue of moral concern, and we need a more careful and nuanced moral framework for analysis of those issues. I mean, just the kind of superficial analysis you find Ersatz, you might say, intuitions on social are they're not going to allow states to flourish and function. There's going to have to be a more nuanced casuistry. But I mean, the deeper crisis really is just the crisis of reference to moral norms and whether there is a basis in human nature for universal moral norms. And there the Church has always said that there is, and that human nature and human dignity are realities intelligible to the human mind, not necessarily evident or easy, but eventually understandable for our natural human reason. We can understand why there's objective moral knowledge. We can articulate why there is objective moral truth in terms of what we ought to do, what we should never do, what is fulfilling to human nature, what is not fulfilling to human nature, how human beings can live in society, how they can thrive and mutually complement one another, or they can derogate from their mutual well-being. So how to nurture the common good, how the common good can be destroyed or wounded. And, tapping into that tradition is of evident value for the universal welfare of the human race, and the Vatican cyclically and habitually does that. So I think, given that we're in an age of social instability and somewhat, you might say, some degree of international turmoil, we can expect the Vatican to go back to those well springs of those resources of human rationality about the common good and moral truthfulness, and we can probably expect to see the emergence of clear teaching on those topics in the years to come. Well, let me say two things about this. The first is to say that in a certain way, to be a unifying figure, Pope Leo XIV has to not be too arch-American. He's not a pope for the United States or the United States of America, getting into the papacy. I mean, he's a Roman Catholic pope for all peoples, and that's obviously something he's channeling, symbolizing, and expressing in his way of being pope already, and it's very welcome and important. But then, secondly, I mean, in terms of the United States experience, I mean, it's a church which, in a certain sense, historically has been ultramontanist or very Rome-referent, because it's coming out of a majority Protestant experience where the difference of being Catholic was very important. So you have this tradition of, Catholic priests and bishops and many lay people being kind of in reference to their Roman identity, reference to the Vatican and to the papacy and the teachings of the church. And then, of course, you also have a tradition of, you might call it a thoughtful alliance and engagement with American liberalism. And there's a range here of all kinds of positions, some which we could say are more morally liberal versions of American Catholicism, others which are, friendly to democracy and elements of liberalism, but keen to instill those with a deeply Catholic influence. And then you have Catholics in America who are just more skeptical of both the liberal and the democratic projects, because you have this kind of idea of the solidity of Catholic tradition operating in the background. Finding and narrating unity in the Catholic Church between people who are concerned about you might say, the supernatural element, the sacramental and the doctrinal truth of Catholicism, and those who are also representing the concerns about the social welfare policies of the Church, or the Catholic social thought of the Church. Ultimately that's all meant to be one thing. And when you have a cauldron of ideas where people are sometimes in debate and even conflict about those tendencies in the faith, you can get from out of that people who are disintegrated or divisive, but you can also get people out of that who are integrated and refined. I think we clearly have someone like that in Pope Leo XIV, a figure who's come through the 1970s and 80s and 90s in the American church and then in the international church, and reached a pretty high degree of spiritual and intellectual refinement and a notion of an integrated whole with regards to the church. And of course, everyone has to work with other people, including the Pope, especially the Pope. The Pope will work with other people. But I think coming out of that American experience of refining how to put the different parts together into the whole, that's going to help him, and it's going to affect the whole Catholic Church. Well, I'm going to give a particular line of reasoning here, and I'm following some of the intuitions of Alistair MacIntyre, which stem from like his great work After Virtue. I think there's a widespread, at this point, acknowledgement among people of various stripes, secular as well as religious, that we lack a common set of convictions and even a common vocabulary in regard to basic moral norms or basic understandings of the foundations of universal moral teaching. It's not like we all share some common set of intuitions that we can readily agree upon about how to resolve moral disputes. Rather, there are a lot of different schools of thinking about moral reasoning that are really varied. The Catholic Church has the advantage here of maintaining in herself a very long tradition of thinking that can touch upon a number of the concerns of varied schools of thinking, virtue theory, even more utilitarian doctrines of morals, and deontological and legal-based norms of duty. I'm referring here, sequentially to Aristotle, to Hume, and to Kant in terms of, moral origins of moral thinking. So, I think CST, Catholic Social Thought, is refreshing to people because it puts you in touch with a whole range of principles that are really sound once they're analyzed. It's hard to refute them. They seem rooted in some common experience of our human nature. They aren't necessarily confessional. They're metaphysical, but they're metaphysical in just the way common knowledge should be. That is grounded in our common experience of reality that seems undeniable. And then I think the other thing about CST is that it's beyond these ideological distinctions of party lines. Like if you take what's to the left or to the right in Europe, or what's to the left and the right in the United States. Those are relative kind of terms. They denote the fact that people can take up positions, you might say, across party lines in conventional circumstances to meet with de facto tensions or opportunities in the political realm. But CST is really above all that. You're trying to get the principles that apply always and everywhere. And that might give you different policies. We can argue about what a just wage is in New York State in 2025. But the principles behind what a just wage is for, and they are multiple, are principles that can be enunciated really kind of perennially once you're thinking seriously about economic participation and the right to be in the market and to participate in the market in a sufficient way. So lower wage arguments would be for participation, getting in the market, and then the higher wage for participating in the market. And then that touches on more collective goods, like how many people are in the market and what's their participation look like. You start with the principles and you move down to the applications. I think CST could, in an age of polarization and really just even agnostic confusion about the moral good, permit us to get back to some foundations based on which we can have really common understanding and common conversations with other people. And I think that makes it very attractive in an age of, on the one hand, kind of relativism, on the other hand, of ideological party line absolutism. Anytime you spend a significant amount of time outside your own country, you learn to see your own country's strengths and weaknesses from the outside, and you also learn to see other cultures' strengths and weaknesses as a visiting guest and resident. You usually learn to receive the values and gifts of a new culture, and you accept in gratitude to be welcomed and, you might say, educated by a different culture. It's clear that Pope Leo XIV has said that his time in Peru was for him a great gift. I mean, he learned, I think, probably a different kind of expression of piety, different kinds of debates and arguments in that local church. He certainly saw a kind of poverty he didn't see on the south side of Chicago, and he was pastorally at the service of people in a different variety of needs, educational and material needs, that he wouldn't have been had he been in, you might say, the Midwest United States. But of course you can compare spiritual poverty and material poverty and spiritual challenges and material challenges, and they can be different in different cultures. I think living in Rome also affords a kind of imperfect but real universal vision or eyeglass by which you can kind of see many cultures, because there's so many people in the church from literally hundreds of countries, So you can get a little window into what's going on in the Catholic Church in Papua New Guinea or Indonesia or Kenya or Nigeria or Germany or Italy or India. And of course, if you're also the superior of a religious order, as the Pope was, the Augustinians, living in Rome but traveling all over the world, not only are you seeing your own religious order, you're seeing the local churches, you're meeting the local bishops, you're getting a kind of window into what's going on in those cultures. And those visitations are rather significant. They take time and they involve real learning. So, that kind of global perspective does push you towards the search for the universal, what's truly universal, but it also gives you a refinement in thinking about also what's particular. What is the particular shape that the church has in this and that culture? How does that culture shape the church? What are the challenges of the church in a given culture, and what are its strengths and contributions? And nobody has anything like universal or perfect understanding in this regard, but it does make a person a potential kind of instrument of God if they have a little bit more of this universal education. It can also work the other way. I mean, you can have a person very provincial, you might say, who comes from a small Italian diocese. I mean, this was true in some ways of Pius X, or in a different way, Leo XIII had spent time in Belgium, but I mean, it's not as wide a range of experience, but they had a deep Catholic formation. So, it's not all about where you've been and who you've met. It's also about who you are in Christ. It's more fundamentally about being enrooted in the Catholic faith and its universal significance. But, God works through these different kinds of experiences and formations that are in us when He's governing the Catholic Church.